The banquet hall smelled like buttered rice and strong perfume. Relatives filled round tables covered in white cloth. Soft music played in the background while my parents stood near the cake, smiling for photos. "And of course," my mother said into the microphone, "not all children turn out the way you hope." Laughter, polite, uncomfortable. She glanced at me. My father added calmly, "Some people just don't have the discipline." Heads turned, not toward them, toward me. I felt the air tighten in my chest. The lights above the stage hummed faintly. My cousins stopped chewing. Someone shifted in their seat. No one defended me. "Have you ever been erased in a room full of people?" I didn't respond. I simply picked up my glass of water and waited. Because this time, I wasn't the one hiding the truth. I have been the failure for as long as I can remember. It started small. When I was 10, I forgot to bring home a permission slip. My father shook his head and said, "You're always careless." My brother forgot his homework the next week. My mother laughed and called him distracted. At family gatherings, stories about my mistakes were repeated like traditions. The time I didn't get into my first choice university, the job I left after 6 months because the environment felt wrong, the apartment I moved out of when the rent became unreasonable. Each story was edited slightly, trimmed, polished, retold in a way that made me look unstable. I learned to sit quietly while they narrated my life for others. Have you ever listened to someone describe you and not recognize yourself? In reality, I worked consistently, paid my bills, built a modest but stable career in project management. I didn't take risks that would impress people. I took the kind that protected me. But stability isn't dramatic, and drama travels further. My parents preferred dramatic. At home, our routines were ordinary. Sunday dinners, laundry folded in silence, my mother labeling containers in the fridge with neat handwriting, my father reading the news at the kitchen table. Nothing explosive, just subtle corrections. "If you had listened to us," my father would say whenever I made a choice he didn't understand. "If you had stayed," my mother would add, "stayed at a job that underpaid me, stayed in relationships that didn't feel safe, stayed quiet, convenience over fairness." It was easier for them to blame me than admit their guidance wasn't perfect. I didn't argue. Not because I agreed, because arguing made me emotional, and emotional confirmed their narrative. So I adjusted. I stopped sharing my plans, stopped asking for advice, stopped correcting the stories when they drifted from truth. Silence became my strategy, but silence has a cost. At that anniversary banquet, when my mother joked about children not turning out right, I realized something. They weren't embarrassed by me, they were protecting something. And I had recently discovered exactly what that something was. The first time I noticed the pattern clearly, I was 23. I had just received a promotion. It wasn't dramatic, just a steady move up in responsibility and pay. I remember calling my mother while standing outside my office building, the wind tugging at my coat. "That's good," she said. "But remember, you left your last job too quickly." She didn't ask about the new role. She reminded me of the old one. At dinner that weekend, my father told relatives, "She changes direction often. We hope she'll settle someday." I sat there, hands folded in my lap, listening to my life being summarized into instability. What they didn't mention was why I left that previous job. The unpaid overtime, the supervisor who made comments about my appearance, the anxiety that kept me awake at night. Have you ever stayed quiet about your reasons just to avoid being called dramatic? I did, and that became a habit. When I moved to a smaller apartment to save money, they told people I couldn't afford the city. When I turned down a family business opportunity because the contract felt unclear, they said I was afraid of commitment. Each story shaved off context. Each retelling polished the blame. At first, I corrected them gently. "That's not exactly what happened," I would say. But correction required energy, and every correction was met with a look. That look that said, "See? Defensive again." So I stopped. I told myself it didn't matter what distant relatives believed, but lies, repeated often enough, become identity. Even my younger cousins began looking at me with subtle pity. One of them once whispered, "It's okay. Not everyone figures it out." I smiled. I had figured out more than they knew. Then, 3 months before the anniversary banquet, something small happened. I was at my parents' house helping my mother sort old paperwork, tax forms, medical receipts, faded envelopes stacked in boxes. She left the room to answer a call. That's when I found it. A letter. Folded neatly, addressed to my father. And it contained information that rewrote everything I had been blamed for. The letter wasn't dramatic. No bold words, no red ink, just typed paragraphs on plain white paper. It was from the company I had left at 22. The job my parents still referenced as proof of my instability. Subject line, formal complaint acknowledgement. My name appeared 3 times in the first paragraph. The letter confirmed that I had reported inappropriate behavior from my supervisor. It documented an internal investigation. It stated that my resignation had been accepted without prejudice and that the company appreciated my professionalism during the review process. I read it twice, slowly. The paper felt thin between my fingers. So this was the full story, the version they never told. I remembered the night I came home exhausted and explained what had happened at work. My father had listened quietly. My mother had said, "These things happen. Don't make it bigger than it is." I resigned 2 weeks later. They told relatives I quit because I couldn't handle pressure. But they had known. They had this letter. Have you ever realized that the truth wasn't hidden from them? Only from everyone else? My hands felt steady as I folded the paper back along its original crease. I wasn't angry in that moment. I was clear. For years, I had carried the label of failure because it was easier for them than admitting they hadn't protected me. Easier to frame me as impulsive than acknowledge the discomfort of misconduct. Easier to preserve their image as parents of stable, successful children than admit their daughter had needed support. I slid the letter into my bag before my mother returned. She resumed sorting receipts like nothing had shifted. But something had. The pattern snapped into focus. Every time I made a decision that protected me, they reframed it as weakness. Every time I stepped away from something unhealthy, they retold it as irresponsibility. It wasn't random. It was consistent. And consistency isn't accident. At the anniversary banquet, when my father joked about discipline and my mother hinted at disappointment, I didn't feel humiliated. I felt prepared, because in my purse that evening was the letter they had chosen to ignore. After I found the letter, I didn't confront them. Not immediately. Instead, I watched. It's strange how clarity sharpens your vision. Small details stand out more when you know what you're looking for. At Sunday dinner the following week, my father mentioned my career again. "She moves around a lot," he told an uncle, still searching. Searching. I noticed how my mother nodded, not aggressively, just in agreement. I felt the letter resting in my bag like a quiet heartbeat. I could have interrupted. I could have said, "Actually, I left that job because my supervisor crossed boundaries and the company acknowledged it." But I didn't, because I wanted to understand something first. Was this forgetfulness or convenience? Have you ever held back not out of fear but out of strategy? I began paying attention to their stories more carefully. When relatives asked about my brother's failed investment, my parents described it as a learning experience. When my sister's business loan fell through, they called it bad timing. But when I made a choice to protect myself, it was always framed as character. Undisciplined, emotional, unstable. Patterns don't shout, they repeat. Over the next few weeks, I withdrew gently. I stopped volunteering information. I stopped attending smaller gatherings. When my mother called to ask about my schedule, I answered briefly. Not cold, just neutral. The distance unsettled them. "You've been quiet," my mother said one evening. "I've been listening," I replied. She laughed lightly as if I were joking, but I wasn't. I reread the letter several times at home. The language was formal, almost sterile, but it carried weight. It validated what I had experienced. It confirmed I had not been reckless. I had been cautious. For years, they allowed others to believe I left because I lacked endurance. They never corrected the narrative, not once. Have you ever realized that silence can be a form of participation? That understanding changed something in me. I stopped defending myself internally. For so long, even when I stayed quiet publicly, I would rehearse explanations in my mind. I would replay conversations, wondering how I could have phrased things better, presented myself more convincingly. That habit faded. I knew the truth now, and truth doesn't need rehearsal. The anniversary banquet approached quickly. My parents were excited. It was their 40th year of marriage, relatives traveling from different cities, a celebration of longevity, stability, image. I helped my mother choose centerpieces, white lilies, simple and elegant. I listened to her talk about seating arrangements and catering costs. She seemed content, almost proud. That night, while we were reviewing the guest list at the kitchen table, I asked casually, "Do you ever regret how certain things were handled?" She didn't look up. "What do you mean?" "Just stories," I said. She paused briefly before responding. "There's no point revisiting old things." "No point. Unless those old things shaped someone's identity." I nodded. That was answer enough. On the day of the banquet, I dressed carefully, not to impress, to feel composed. I tucked the letter into a slim folder and placed it in my bag, not as a weapon, as evidence. During the speeches, my father spoke confidently about resilience and discipline. My mother followed with anecdotes about raising children who took different paths. The room laughed gently. And then came the line, "Not all children turn out the way you hope." A familiar phrase, polished for public use. I didn't flinch, because for the first time I wasn't shrinking under it. I was measuring it. Have you ever sat calmly while someone unknowingly builds the stage for their own exposure? When the applause faded and glasses clinked, I stood slowly, not rushed, not dramatic. I walked toward the front of the room, the folder light in my hand, and I asked if I could say something. The microphone felt cool in my hand. The room quieted politely. A few relatives smiled, expecting a sentimental toast. My mother looked mildly surprised. My father's expression remained controlled, though I noticed his shoulders stiffen slightly. "I just want to add something," I said. My voice didn't shake. For years, I've heard stories about myself, about decisions I made, about jobs I left, about discipline and stability. Soft shifting in chairs, a fork placed down on porcelain. I've stayed quiet because I didn't want to embarrass anyone. I paused, letting that settle. But silence can create its own story. I opened the folder and removed the letter. The paper made a faint sound as I unfolded it. "This is from the company I left years ago, the one often mentioned as proof that I couldn't handle pressure." My father's jaw tightened. "It documents a formal complaint I filed regarding misconduct. An investigation that confirmed my concerns. My resignation was accepted professionally." I didn't raise my tone. I didn't accuse. I simply read one paragraph aloud. The words filled the hall, clinical and undeniable. The room shifted. My aunt blinked. My cousin leaned forward. Someone whispered, "I didn't know." Of course they didn't. I looked toward my parents. "They had this letter," I said calmly. "They knew why I left." The silence now was different, heavier. Have you ever watched a narrative pause mid-sentence? My mother's face lost color. My father stared at the tablecloth as if studying its pattern. "I didn't leave because I was unstable," I continued. "I left because I chose my safety." The word safety hung in the air. I wasn't attacking them. I wasn't shouting. I was correcting. "For years," I added. I allowed the incomplete version to stand. I folded the paper carefully. That ends tonight. No applause, no dramatic reaction, just awareness. And awareness can dismantle years of quiet distortion. No one argued. That was the strangest part. There was no dramatic defense, no raised voices, no attempt to twist the letter into something else, just stillness. My father finally looked up, but not at me. His gaze drifted across the room, as if calculating how much had shifted. My mother cleared her throat. "It wasn't necessary to bring that up here," she said softly. "Not wrong, not untrue, just unnecessary." I nodded slowly. "For years," I replied. "It was necessary for me." The difference mattered. Relatives avoided eye contact with my parents now. Conversations resumed in low murmurs, but the tone had changed. The narrative had cracked. I didn't wait for more. I handed the letter back to myself, placed it into the folder, and stepped away from the microphone. No mic drop, no dramatic exit, just a quiet return to my seat. Have you ever felt something release inside you without noise? The rest of the evening blurred gently. People spoke to me differently, more directly. Some offered awkward sympathy, others just nodded with a new kind of respect. But the real shift wasn't external. It was internal. I realized I didn't need them to admit anything publicly. I didn't need an apology in front of witnesses. I needed to stop carrying their version of me. When I left the banquet hall, the night air felt cool against my skin. The parking lot lights hummed softly. I stood beside my car for a moment, breathing. No anger, no triumph. Just clarity. I had corrected the record, not to destroy them, to reclaim myself. A week later, my father called. Not to argue, not to defend, just to say, "We should have handled that differently." The sentence was plain, almost awkward. For a man who built his reputation on certainty, it sounded unfamiliar. I didn't rush to respond. "I'm not trying to ruin anything," I said quietly. "I just didn't want to keep carrying something that wasn't true." There was a long pause on the line. "We never meant to make you look bad," he replied. Intent. That word again. I leaned back on my couch, staring at the faint crack in the ceiling I had noticed months ago. "I don't think you meant to," I said. "But it happened." That was the difference now. I wasn't arguing about feelings. I was naming facts. For years, they framed my decisions as weakness because it was easier than acknowledging discomfort. It was easier to call me unstable than admit they didn't protect me. Easier to laugh at my job change than explain why I had needed to leave. They had chosen image over nuance, and I had chosen silence. Until I didn't. After that phone call, my mother sent a short message. "We're proud of you. We just didn't always say it well." It wasn't a grand apology, but it was closer to truth than anything before. Over the next few months, something subtle shifted in the family. When relatives mentioned my career, my father corrected them. "She left that job because it wasn't safe," he said once at dinner. "No defensiveness, just clarity." My mother stopped making small jokes about discipline. Instead, she asked questions. "What are you working on now? Are you enjoying it?" Simple things, but new. Have you ever noticed how people adjust once they realize you're no longer absorbing the weight? The biggest change wasn't in them. It was in me. I stopped scanning rooms for judgment, stopped bracing myself for correction, stopped rehearsing explanations before speaking. When my cousin once joked lightly about my career detours, I smiled and said calmly, "I make decisions that protect me." No tension followed, because there was no hesitation in my voice. Confidence changes tone, and tone changes rooms. I also noticed something unexpected. My younger cousins began asking me for advice privately, about jobs, about boundaries, about leaving situations that didn't feel right. "You were brave," one of them said quietly. I almost laughed. For years, I was the cautionary tale. Now I was the example. Not because I exposed anyone, because I refused to keep shrinking. Have you ever realized that the moment you stop defending yourself, you start defining yourself? The truth I revealed that night didn't collapse their entire world. It collapsed the illusion. And sometimes that's enough. My parents still host dinners, still celebrate milestones, still tell stories. But the stories are more careful now, more balanced. When they mention my career path, they include the context. When they describe my decisions, they speak about strength instead of instability. They didn't lose their image. They just lost control of mine. That was the real shift. One evening, months later, my father and I sat on the back porch after dinner. The sun was fading slowly behind the houses across the street. "I suppose," he said thoughtfully, "we worried too much about how things looked." I nodded. "I used to worry about that too," I replied, "about how I looked in your stories." He glanced at me, then away. "You've always been more steady than we gave you credit for." It wasn't dramatic, but it was honest. And honesty, even late, has weight. I don't pretend everything changed overnight. Patterns built over decades don't disappear in a single speech. But something fundamental shifted. I no longer wait to be introduced correctly. I introduce myself. I no longer allow incomplete stories to circulate without context. I provide it. Not aggressively, not emotionally, just clearly. For years, my name was attached to doubt, exaggeration, and convenient edits. Now it's attached to fact. And that matters. If this resonates with you, like the video and share your story below. Sometimes the quietest corrections create the deepest impact. I stayed silent for years. I watched. I waited. Not for revenge, for the right moment to speak. And when I did, I didn't destroy anything. I simply removed the distortion. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of owning it. What would you have done in my place? Comment below.